Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we will start the first session, the next session. Quick thing to the people who is presenting here, maybe. This is the mic for Zoom, and that is the mic for this room. So, yeah, if you speak in a low voice, maybe you should try to use both at the same time. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Nakai Keigo from the Faculty of Education, Kyoto University. I've been doing research on the educational anthropology of the Kyoto School, and my main focus is Kuki Shuzo's philosophy. It aims to challenge the taken for granted view of education from the perspective of the Kyoto School philosophy, so it is included in the postmodern education study. Today, I'm going to talk about my research focusing on two thinkers, Koyama Iwao and Kuki Shuzo. But before that, I shall emphasize this kind of research may provide a concrete vision of the Kyoto School's some esoteric philosophy, especially Nishida's logic of Basho. In the book Nishida's Philosophy and Dewey's Philosophy, Ueda Seiji, a Japanese scholar of pragmatism, explored an intersection of Nishida and Dewey. Dewey is one of the most well-known and pivotal figures for the philosophy of education. Ueda says, if we were to formulate a philosophy of education as one structure of Nishida's philosophy, it would inevitably have a character of Dewey-one philosophy of education. But why? According to Ueda, two thinkers shares the idea of historical life, 歴史的生命. In Dewey, the essence of this historical life lies in human thinking. Thinking is the front line of the historical progression, and it is creative in the sense of the dialectical development. His concept of education consists of the assistance in learner's thinking. Therefore, Ueda expresses the core of Dewey's notion of education as the engagement in the thinking process. On the other hand, Nishida's view of education centers on the formation, keisei sayo, rather than thinking. In an article entitled On Pedagogy, 教育学について, he writes, we must regard the engagement in the formation, keisei sayo, as tutoring, 教科. In this sense, I'd like to consider as an educator's mission to support the world's becoming 天地の開口タスク. We can say that Nishida's thought of determination of basho, determination of place, is specialized as a leading principle of education in this article. Despite the differences of words, in Ueda's view, Dewey's thinking and Nishida's formation have the same meaning as the dialectical process of the historical life. But can we conclude that the philosophy of education as one structure of Nishida's philosophy would inevitably get close to Dewey's one? Towards this point, Mineshima Hideo expresses skepticism. He refutes Ueda in terms of the lack of absolute negation in Dewey's philosophy. For Dewey, a negative moment is expressed as conflict. However, according to Mineshima, the conflict in Dewey is neither affirmation intermediated by negation, like in the Hegelian sense, nor so drastic as self-identity of absolute contradiction, 絶対矛盾的自己同一 in Nishida's philosophy. In Dewey's case, it seems that contradictory things would fortunately achieve harmony at last. Therefore, it is not affirmation as the absolute conversion of negation. Mineshima's critique underlines that Deweyan negativity differs from that of Nishida. Even if so, should we conclude that Ueda's endeavor to juxtapose Nishida and Dewey ended up in failure? So our problem here is how we can bridge these two thinkers, namely the pioneer of the Kyoto School and the most influential thinker in the field of education. I suppose that these two lines of thought can stimulate each other. Education will help the Kyoto School to concretize or democratize their philosophy, and in turn, the Kyoto School philosophy will provide a strong and novel explanatory model for education. Not limited to Dewey's case, many educational thinkers or contemporary educational scientists seem not to hesitate to use terms related to continuity, unlike contemporary philosophers. Therefore, there seems to lack absolute or drastic negativity that denies identity or self, compared to the case of the Kyoto School philosophy. Yet what matters here is not to abandon the possible intersection of philosophy and pedagogical studies, but to polish the concept of negativity of the experience. Actually, the concept of negativity appears to glimmer in the realm of philosophy of education recently. I believe Japanese philosophy, especially the Kyoto School philosophy, can greatly contribute to this problem. In my presentation today, I will not go deeply into Dewey because I'm not an expert on Dewey, but I'd like to provide a framework for the Kyoto School's pedagogy or educational sciences. First, I shall examine Koyama Iwao's philosophy of education. Koyama Iwao was one of the brightest students under Nishida Kitaro and Tanabe Hajime, and he organized his original logic of identity in antiphony, Kōteki Doitsu, through critically succeeding to Nishida's logic of place and Tanabe's dialectic of absolute mediation. Actually, Koyama's logic of identity in antiphony was formed by Dewey's logical theory, as if it testifies to Ueda Sage's statement quoted in the outset. The origin of Koyama's logic is founded as the theory of unity of universe and human, Tenjin Goitsu, in an article Geographical Character and History and Historical Character of Geography. In this article, Koyama suggests that history can be considered only upon the inactive unification, Koiteki Sogo, of historicity, temporality, or spontaneity of spirit, and geography, or spatiality and natural conditions. After he criticizes two positions of historical study, that is geographical determinism and geographical possibilism, then he amplifies his own more positive principle of history as the unity of universe and human. This principle is named the correspondence in antiphony, Kōteki Gachi, of the geographical environment and the spontaneous spirit of a subject. According to him, this principle is the most fundamental principle of the reality. The correspondence of human and nature, or the unity of the universe and human, re-emerges as the identity in antiphony in a book in 1951, The Logic of Place and the Principle of Antiphony, 場所的論理と公的公の原理. Koyama takes Nishida's logic and Tanabe's logic as examples of the logic of nothingness, namely the philosophical logic. However, according to him, these two versions of logic are abstract and passive. As with the case of the philosophy of history, most positive and concrete logic can be found in the logic of place, based on the principle of antiphony. Koyama's logic of the identity in antiphony has the schema of task and solution. He says the logic of place in the form of task and solution indicates the most fundamental structure of reality itself. Preceding the separation of theory and practice, it is a schema of theory and knowledge, and at the same time that of action and practice. Koyama underlines task and solution have an inseparable relationship. In other words, there is no response without what is called, and there is no call without what responds. Koyama's logic sketched above seems to resemble Dewey's one. However, Koyama emphasizes the difference between the two positions. According to him, the logic of inquiry must be fundamentally the logic of antiphony. The logic of antiphony is philosophical logic, so it can be said for Koyama, humanities and the social sciences are more fundamental than natural sciences. The latter is Dewey's position. The inquiry in humanities and the social sciences means that the reality calls for the sciences' self-awakening of their task, kadai no jikaku, and makes them contemplate a solution for it. In other words, while natural sciences in Dewey inquire about reality, humanities and the social sciences in Koyama inquire in the reality or in the place. In this way, Koyama emphasizes their differences. In that way, Koyama gives a foundation for the concept of inquiry, a concept which is frequently used in pedagogical discussions, via the idea of antiphony in the place. This framework is reproduced in his philosophy of education, but we can find in the text an insightful addition to the explanation of the schema of task and solution. Koyama says as follows: we cannot arbitrarily generate the task. The task imposed on us at present is given by the past, and is not to be altered. So to speak, it is fateful, unmeiteki. The relationship of task and solution is of antiphony, so the task itself demands the solution. Therefore, the task is not merely of the past, but it calls for the solution, namely invokes the solution. Koyama expresses this inevitable engagement in the solution of the task as fate, unmei. In my view, this fate indicates the negation of the negation of the stable subject. This negation is the driving force of learning, and the guidance and coordination of it is the mission of educators. Such a negation is originated from Basho, since the inquiry or the schema of task and solution is interpreted through the idea of Basho in the indifference of subject and object. Learners can be negated by otherness. So in Koyama's philosophy of education, Nishida's opinion cited at the outset is concretized as the support of self-awakening of one's task with self-negation in the place. I'd like to characterize this type of view of education as negative education, following Sevilla Luis Anton's phrasing. According to Sevilla, the theory of negative education considers that the human being becomes most human through a negative movement of subtraction by letting go of self. Through this letting go of self, the self is able to open up to reality in its fundamentally paradoxical nature, and at the same time is able to awaken to its own authenticity, its no-self nature. So the self-negation might sound somewhat religious, but it can apply to usual practices of education. As I suggested from Koyama's philosophy, the appearance of the fateful problem can be interpreted as the self-negation of the stable subject. It looks like ordinary thing, but such a view is a challenge for a usual vision of education, such as developmentalism. For the position of negative education, the core is negation, not the continuous enlargement of the self. The process of self-negation is also found in the concept of philosophy of the Kyoto school. The unending negation or self-criticism is an essential element for education. However, for instance, Koyama's explanation for it is questionable. He gives many examples of the crisis for children, like the natural disasters, the accidents of car, train, airplane, and so forth, or the accidental disasters such as fire, watery deaths, serious injuries. But they are one-sided. They are too unusual. If the negation against the self makes no sense without such unusual disastrous events, the idea of a negative education could not be an encompassing educational theory. In this presentation, I pay attention to Koyama because he is the eminent thinker who wrote the book Philosophy of Education, but many other thinkers in the Kyoto School have the same tendency. We need to broaden the concept of negation or negativity. Then I suppose Kuki Shuzo can shed a new light on the concept of negation. Kuki focuses on an emotion of surprise in his philosophy of contingency. I suggest that this concept of surprise is another version of self-negation in the Kyoto School philosophy. According to Kuki, the core meaning of contingency is the possibility of non-existence. So contingent events disclose nothingness which lies in the basis of our existence. Surprise is an emotion we experience in a contingent event. Kuki also explains it as the consequence of metaphysical thinking, but insofar as thinking is one of our experiences, it is included in an encounter with contingent things. Therefore, we can say surprise is the negation of identity, the disclosure of duality, and the disclosure of the possibility of non-existence, whether in philosophical thinking or in daily life. To become open up into the phenomenon of surprise means to accept the negation of identity, that is to participate in self-negation. To interpret surprise as a negation means not to interpret it in a negative sense. For Kuki, to see directly the contingency as reality at the present is the original, primary, and primitive fact. These words suggest that to face the contingency is to be open up to reality directly. To be surprised is not a negative thing, but rather the driving force for us to turn to reality. Of course, the identity is not always negated. We have many ways to recover the identity from its negation, namely from the state of surprise. Kuki calls such means the interiorization of a contingency, Guzensei no Naimenka. We live the life between the interiorization of a contingency and its negation of surprise. So Kuki says, the interiorization of contingency is the task given to the limited existent and at the same time the salvation of it. I shall provide the visual summarizing Kuki's philosophy here. Now I cannot state the details, but what I have to say is in Kuki's philosophy, a surprise functions as the most fundamental moment of a negation, preceding the division of subject and object, or the dichotomy of mind and body. The last picture shows a rough image of a pedagogical version of the discontinuous continuity. Along with despair, sorrow, and depression, surprise, wonder, or amazement can be expressions of negation. We may add here other phenomena. Lastly, I'd like to emphasize that Kyoto School philosophy can definitely contribute to recast the Western pedagogical theory in this way. Our challenge is just getting started. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
And speak there. No, yeah, it was a...
I'm sorry.
Okay. It's more of a comment than a question to your presentation. So I understand that you kind of want to take the best of Kyoto School and apply it to education, right? And I kind of wondered that it's interesting that you took like what was Odoroki, right, as one of the leading things you can take from Kyoto School, right? Whereas well, there is this very famous quote from Nishida, right? It goes something like, "Tetsugaku no douki wa odoroki de wa nakushite fukai jinsei no hiyai de aru to." Right, so actually by going with Odoroki, you're going back to Aristotle rather than Kyoto School, right? So I was just interested in like how would you respond to this sort of pretty obvious like criticism? Right. Oh.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yes, actually, I also pay attention to Nishida's opinion about the
deep sorrows of life.
Yes, Nishida philosophy has deep sorrow. But I feel the negation or self-contradiction, self-negation should be expressed in each stages in life in different ways. So deep sorrow is also one of them, but surprise is also one of them. So like I imagine the children's life. So children will not feel deep sorrow for the antinomy of reason.
Okay.
So I feel the Kyoto school only look into the adults' life. So they dismiss children or elderly people. So I want to broaden their fruitful discussion about negation by using term surprise or wonder.
Okay, so you're not so much like taking ideas from Kyoto school and applying them to education, but rather taking ideas from education and applying them to Kyoto school. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.